Jane Velez-Mitchell with Jane Unchained. We are here with our Boycott Meat Roundtable, and we're very delighted and honored to have today Saffin Parrish-Sams, who is considered one of the leading workers' comp attorneys in the United States. She has a wealth of knowledge. We thank you for joining us. Want to ask you about the fact that more than 200 meatpacking workers have died in the United States of COVID-19. At least 42,534 slaughterhouse workers have gotten COVID-19. Now, OSHA, which is the federal agency in charge of worker safety, has just issued fines to two meatpacking plants that total just under $30,000. These are companies that make billions and billions of dollars a year. So in the widespread reporting, the Washington Post says essentially it's a pittance for them. It's chump change. So what is your reaction as a workers' comp attorney to that message from the federal government? And how does a worker who's gotten COVID or who's a member of a family where a meatpacking worker has died of COVID, how do they get compensation? Either workers' comp or family death benefits?
Yeah, well, I mean, the slap on the wrist from OSHA is a bit disappointing, I think, to everyone, especially when you consider that these are for-profit companies. And so what changes behavior? Well, what changes behavior is an effect on the bottom line. And the OSHA fines are not going to have an effect on the bottom line. But to answer your second part of your question, you know, these employers, meatpacking plants are particularly an employer at issue, but we also have, you know, health services workers, frontline workers, people who are working in hospitals and nursing homes, things of that nature. When you have an employer who is, I guess, widely known based on the statistics to have a prevalence of COVID within their workplace, people should consider looking at bringing a workers' compensation case. Now, what is a workers' compensation case? Workers' compensation is a little bit different from a liability claim. In liability, in traditional tort, you have to show some sort of fault by your employer. And that's where, you know, some of these fines and OSHA findings where they disregarded worker safety becomes important because you have to prove liability. But in workers' compensation, this is a system where the injured worker, or in the case of a death, the surviving spouse or children are entitled to benefits based on the fact that the injured worker died because of something that occurred in their workplace. And you don't have to prove fault. What you have to prove is that the death arose out of and in the course of employment. Well, what does arising out of in the course of employment mean with respect to COVID? What you have to show is that more likely than not, the injured worker contracted COVID in their workplace. And so when we have places like meatpacking plants or hospitals, nursing homes, places like that, where we know that these people are going to work every day, putting their lives on the line as essential workers, and are being subjected to a higher rate of exposure than, and particularly with meatpacking plants where they're not necessarily following social distancing, the safety protocols that we know the CDC is recommending, that puts them at an increased likelihood of contracting COVID in their workplace. And then you look at the fact that statistically, there's a higher number of meatpacking workers who are contracting COVID than what you see in the general population. That creates a strong likelihood of being able to prove that they contracted COVID at their workplace, and that you would be able to then make a claim for workers' compensation benefits. Now,
let me ask you a quick question, because one of the things that was immediately said after the slaughterhouses started to become COVID-19 hotspots, And members of the administration came out and said, oh, it's the lifestyle of the workers because they are often impoverished. In fact, that's the only reason why you would take a job at a slaughterhouse is that you're impoverished and you really don't have another option. Nobody wants to be a slaughterhouse worker killing animals all day or deboning animals all day. It's not something that you aspire to be. It's a last resort job option. And it was very interesting that the administration immediately started downplaying that they got the COVID at the slaughterhouse when obviously the slaughterhouses are hotbeds of COVID and they didn't just get it, walking around their neighborhood. So do you think that was an attempt to help the companies protect from workers' comp lawsuits?
I do think so. I notice a trend with attorneys who are representing insurance companies and employers trying to downplay the connection between workplace exposure to COVID versus out in the general population. And they will try to defend wrongful death suits under work comp or for people who are hospitalized and have significant health consequences from COVID. They will try to downplay the work exposure. But what we know is that, the percentage of the general population who has COVID compared to the percentage of the working population in some of these frontline worker environments, including meatpacking plants, there's a statistical difference in there. And so, they're doing that to discourage people from filing workers' compensation claims. However, if for anybody who has a loved one who has been hospitalized, who has, these exorbitant hospital bills, being on life support, ventilation systems, or who has the long-term sequela that we're now knowing about, whether it's, long-term breathing problems, heart conditions, or, for the families who my heart truly goes out to, the ones who have a loved one who dies from this,
Yes.
They should be seeking a workers' compensation attorney because particularly with respect to some of these frontline workers and the places that we know are the hotbeds for COVID, at least in Iowa, you have to prove that it's more likely than not that you contracted it at work versus out in the general public.
I know you have to go in a second, but I want to ask Joe Enriquez Henry, who is with LULAC, represents workers as well as Forward Latino. Is there a way to help these workers seek workers' compensation by partnering them with attorneys? I mean, they're not in a position where they can just be like interviewing attorneys. They're trying to survive. They're sick. And in some cases, you're dealing with families of people who have died. Again, more than 203 slaughterhouse workers have died of COVID. Can you work to hook them up with attorneys, Joe?
Yeah, most definitely, Jane. I mean, that's what we've done in the past. We did that at JBS back in 2016 when hundreds of workers were concerned about line speed and the safety in the workplace. And there are worker comp attorneys that are reaching out in different parts of the state. But clearly what Saffin is stating here is something where we need to get many more of these workers who are concerned about what's happening. I'm not sure which client Saffin has right now, but I'm sure she is focused on all the many of the 22 meat processing facilities in the state.
All right. Well, any final thoughts? Because I know you have to run, Saffin, on what people should do. Let's say they have a relative who's died, and I keep putting up this picture, but this is a woman who works at a slaughterhouse, and I don't know what her condition is, but there she is in the hospital. This is not like the flu. This is obviously a deadly disease. It's killed at least 190,000 Americans.
Well, I would encourage people to reach out to an attorney and at least explore their options. Look, we know that meatpacking plants and other employers, we know that, for example, Tyson and other meatpacking plants were behind some of the decimation of the workers' compensation system in 2017, where they tried to make it harder for injured workers to file claims. We know that from studies from the Department of Labor and OSHA, that there's a real attempt to try to keep injured workers from pursuing workers' compensation claims. They make it difficult. They put them in fear of their jobs if they make these kinds of claims. We also know from the Department of Labor and OSHA that due to this kind of race to the bottom, approximately 80% of the cost of workplace injuries and deaths it's borne by the taxpayers and the injured workers themselves, because the employers are not being held responsible for these things because of these efforts to make it difficult to file claims. So two things, in my opinion. One is there's never going to be an incentive for the employers to make their workplace safe unless they are held responsible for the full cost of workplace injury or deaths, because they're for-profit companies. The bottom line is, when it becomes expensive to sort of sacrifice injured workers as widgets as part of their production process, they don't have the same incentive to make their workplaces safe. So, you could be helping somebody else by pursuing a claim that puts that cost back on the employer or the insurance company, instead of you and the taxpayers bearing that cost. So this is how change happens in a system, first of all. So that's my first thought on that. My second thought is, look, most attorneys who do people do so on a contingency fee basis, and most of us will give a free initial consultation to somebody, and you can always call an attorney and ask to talk to them without your employer knowing about it, so you can at least explore your options, explore what the risks and benefits are, and make an informed decision about what you need to do to protect yourself and your family.
You made a very good point, is that some people go, oh, a lawyer, I can't afford a lawyer. They can work on contingency. They get a percentage of the settlement, and they don't have to put any money up front. I want to thank you so much, Saffin Parrish-Sams, one of the nation's leading experts on workers' compensation. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.